Dear students, in this lecture, we will be discussing features of ancient Indian political thought pertaining to the post-Vedic period. Now, the Vedic period roughly stretches from the 1700 BC to the 600 BC. So, the post-Vedic period starts from 600 BC till 10th century AD. So, this is a long time and the area under discussion is quite vast. In some points of time, particularly during the Maurya rule, during the time of Ashoka, and also during the Gupta period, particularly during the time of Samudragupta, almost the entire portion of modern India came within their jurisdiction. Again, on some other occasions, at some different points of time, the rule of one single ruler was not available over the entire area because the entire area was divided into different principalities and provinces. So, these features of the post-Vedic period relate to different aspects, different areas, and on different points of time. Now, coming to the most principal feature of ancient Indian political thought of the post-Vedic period, the concept of territoriality, which was absent during the Vedic times and particularly during the early Vedic times, came to the fore during the post-Vedic era. We all know that Janapada or territory constituted one of the major angas of state during the post-Vedic period. So, the ruler was not just a ruler of a particular clan or tribe. He was the ruler of a particular area. So, the modern concept of statecraft and the modern concept of monarch or the monarchical form of government gradually evolved from the late Vedic period, which crystallized into a kind of institution during the post-Vedic period. Now, looking at the features of the ancient Indian political thought during the post-Vedic period, we should remember a particular word which pertains to different features and different activities. That particular word is dharma. Dharma here means a particular essence and not a particular religion. In Sanskrit, it is said, dharayati yasa dharma. So, dharma here means the essence or the nature. Like, for instance, the dharma of a teacher is to teach, or the dharma of water is to flow from a higher plane to a lower plane. So, in this respect, the word dharma was used in the post-Vedic ancient Indian political thought. This dharma becomes an important constituent or component of the statecraft. For instance, let us begin with one of the principal features of the statecraft, which is called Rajdharma. Here, Rajdharma means the dharma of the Raja or the basic duties of the king. It is mentioned that the basic duty of the king was to protect his subjects. Here it should also be remembered that the duty aspect should not be analyzed only from a negative standpoint, but also from a positive standpoint, implying thereby that the king's duty was to protect his subjects as well as to give support to his subjects. In fact, at one point in Manu Smriti, we find that Manu prescribed that the king should lead his subjects to the battlefield, and he also mentioned that the king who died in the battlefield will go to heaven in future. So, the Rajdharma has been emphasized in minutest details in different literary sources of ancient Indian political thought. Incidentally, it should be mentioned here that the Indian political thought, and particularly the ancient Indian political thought, revolves around the concept of duties, and we do not come across much ideas or literature about the concept of rights. Today we are very, very concerned about our rights, but in ancient India, the concept of duties overshadowed the concept of rights. And here we find that in the case of Raj Dharma too, it was the duties that in fact characterized the king. It is to be mentioned here that it is not only the duties of the king that were mentioned. In fact, it was a kind of reciprocal relationship that was spoken of in many of the literary sources of ancient India. That is, the king should look after the subjects, and it was also the duty of the subjects to give obedience to the king, to give protection to the king, to give certain elements as their a kind of taxation to the king. So it was a kind of reciprocal relation that characterized the institution called Raj Dharma. One has to mention here that the Raj Dharma, or the functions of the king in ancient India, were not something unlimited. In fact, the imperialist scholarship on ancient Indian political thought pointed out that there was no democratic element in ancient India. The kings of ancient India were absolutely autocratic. They did not look after the demands of the people. But here it should be mentioned that these kinds of arguments were not true. They were not based upon evidences. In fact, the evidences pointed to something else, that there were kinds of checks and limitations on the powers of the king. We know that the kings did not perform their duties single-handedly. There were many other personnel, and we may call them offices or even institutions that used to give advices to the king. The institution of Raj Purohit is one such illustration. The Raj Purohit happens to be someone who was very, very scholarly, who knew the various aspects of statecraft, various aspects of administration and governance, and seldom do we come across a situation when the king did not listen to his advice. So the institution of Raj Purohit, along with the other Purohits, that is the priests, acted as some kind of checks and limitations on the apparently autocratic functioning and purview of the king. We know that the Western political thought from the 1930s talked about some kind of welfare state, which in fact was popularized by the post-Second World War European states and was followed by many of the newly independent states of 1950s and 1960s. Although the concept and the model of the welfare state today is not that popular, and a kind of neoliberal state has evolved, but it is to be mentioned here emphatically that the idea of welfare state is not something which is Western, which was given by some British scholars and British report during the time of the Second World War. No. The welfare state, the idea of welfare state was present even in ancient India in the very concept of Raj Dharma. Now, the second feature of the post-Vedic ancient Indian political thought is the other institutions or the other political offices, barring or excepting the institution of the monarch. We know that the Saptanga theory of the state mentions 7 angas or limbs of the state. Of these, apart from the Raja or the Swami, we have the Amatya, the Janapada, the Durga, the Kosha, the Danda, and the Mitra. Now, by Amatya, actually several offices were meant, the most important of which was the Mantri. It was the duty of the Mantri to give advices to the king. So, on the advice of the Mantris, the Raja or the Swami or the ruler conducted the day-to-day activities of administration. Apart from the Mantri, we come across the institution of Yuvaraja. The Yuvaraja or the crowned prince also helped the king or the ruler by giving him advices, by taking leadership on certain occasions, and particularly in the case of the death of the monarch, the Yuvaraja took over the mantle of the statecraft. So, Yuvaraja was another important element within the ambit of Amatya. The third important institution was already mentioned to an extent, but should be emphatically mentioned once again, that it was the institution of the Purahita. Other than Purahita, Mantri, and the institution of Yuvaraja, we also have some personnel who were described as senanis, or those the soldiers or the commanders of army. So all these in fact helped the king, the Swami, in different aspects, and on the advice of these offices and institutions and personnel, the king conducted the administration, and it was the duty of the king to run the state successfully. The third important element that should be mentioned here is justice. Now, the exact Sanskrit word used to express justice again was dharma. But here, dharma was mentioned or to be analyzed from the perspective of dispensing justice. Justice happened to be one of the major duties of the king, to look after the legal disputes, to book the legal offenders, to give punishments to them, and finally to bring an order in the society. In fact, the Dharma Shastras, the Dharma Sutras, and the Smriti literature talked about how the king should establish justice. In fact, the practical application and the dispensation of justice has been mentioned as Babhuhara or Bibidha Padas. There were 18 different padas that were mentioned in different Dharma Shastras, which the king should take into consideration for dispensing justice in order to maintain law and order in the society. In this respect, the king was helped by different officials. Some of these officials have been mentioned in the Dharma Shastras as the Chief Justice, the Sabhya, the Smriti, the Ganaka, the Lekhaka, the Swapurusha, and particularly the Swarna and the Agni. It was mentioned that while court proceedings were going on, the witnesses and the offenders had to take oath in front of gold, water, and fire. All those mentioned in the courts were taken care of by the Ganakas and the Sabhyas, and in this way the king listened to the advices of the Purohitas, and on the basis of the points mentioned by the offenders and other legal advisors, the king ultimately took a decision. That decision was mentioned in the court by the Chief Justice, and ultimately the punishments and other offences were mentioned by the king in the royal court. So the different aspects of dispensation of justice were mentioned very clearly in the Dharma Shastras, in the Dharma Sutras, and in the Smriti literature. We have in fact come across 4 kinds of courts. One is the pratisthita, that is the court which is established, whose existence was not moving from one place to another. The second one is the apratisthita, means thereby that the courts were a kind of moving exercises where from one part of the state it moved to another part to help the subjects. And the 2 others were the mudrita and the shashita. Mudrita means the written documents that were used in the dispensation of justice. And the shashita means the orders of the king that were from time to time released for a betterment of the society, for maintenance of the law and order in the society. But here, one point should be mentioned, that the king was considered to be the personification of justice. In other words, we may say that the king can do no wrong. It was the king who only can deliver justice. There is no other institution which could be utilized for the purpose. The king could certainly take advices from many institutions or offices, but ultimately it was the king who could only deliver justice. So here we find a kind of system bordering on elements of, we may say, autocracy, where the orders of the king remained final or absolute, or this is a justice with capital J. So the justice aspect is one of the major features of ancient Indian political thought pertaining to the post-Vedic period. The next feature that we should mention here is that society by that time was organized along caste lines or along varna lines more prominently than it was during the later Vedic period. The casteism and the casteist manifestations were there in the post-Vedic ancient Indian society. It should also be mentioned here that from then on, casteism or casteist manifestations were not based upon profession or work. It became hereditary in its nature. So, a kind of social immobility could be found in that kind of society where the son of a Vaishya could never become a brahmana even if he learned a lot, or vice versa. And in this way, the varnashram dharma established itself again as one of the dharmas of the society. And incidentally and ironically, one of the Raj dharmas happened to be to maintain these varnashram dharma. Now coming to the next important feature, from this period onwards, we find the seclusion of woman, the confinement of woman within the 4 walls of the home. We find in the early Vedic period, there were many women scholars who were gradually decreasing and declining during the later Vedic period, and in the post-Vedic period, we find a kind of society which was absolutely patriarchal. There was no voice of woman. In fact, woman could not be found in the public place. Here it should be mentioned that the women who belonged to the different families had to remain content within the 4 walls. But incidentally and ironically, there were some women who were not treated as women belonging to families, but they learned the different kinds of art and education, and some of them became very prominent in ancient society. Some, in fact, happened to be great advisors to the king even. Some, in fact, worked as spies, but they were not normally regarded as family women. Now, coming to the next important feature, we find that the society was a kind of a status quoist society. It was, the changes were not allowed to a large extent by the rulers, by those in authority. Anything in the form of protest were suppressed with heavy hand. The dissenting voices were not allowed to express their opinion. So gradually, the kind of constitutional monarchy and the checks and limitations that we were talking about came to an end, and gradually a kind of autocratic rule about which the Western scholars were so very critical and the modern Indian rational mind was so very critical, gradually evolved during the post-Vedic period. From that time onwards, the expansion of territory, the integration of many people within a single empire gradually evolved, and the autocratic form of governance became almost the standard administrative structure. So the society became somewhat status quoist, where changes were not allowed. Another feature comes next, that is, the state was gradually considered as a means to achieve some end. And from then on, the purusharthas, the four purusharthas, the dharma, the artha, the kama, and the moksha. Now, of these four values, all along it is true that dharma was regarded as something highest, of highest value, of highest importance. But gradually, after dharma, the artha and the kama took their positions, and in the case of moksha, it began to be debated that which one is the moksha for whom. In fact, the state was regarded as a means to an end, that is, means to the moksha. If justice was regarded as the moksha, the state was utilized from that perspective. If artha was regarded as the moksha, the state was utilized from that perspective. If annexation of territories, if increasing the wealth of the state became the moksha, then again the state was utilized from that perspective. So the state became a means to an end. Here we can make a very sharp distinction between the ancient Indian idea of viewing the state with the Hegelian idea of state, which is so very important in the Western political thought. To Hegel, the dialectics and the process of dialectics ultimately lead to a position when the state became the absolute. It is the state which became an end. No one can in fact surpass that end. And the state does not become a means, it becomes an end in itself. This kind of argument, this kind of reflection was not at all present during the ancient Indian political thought. So we may summarize all these features by mentioning that the limited and the constitutional monarchy gradually led to a condition of some kind of autocratic monarchy. The society, which was to a large extent mobile and to a large extent allowed mobility, gradually became status quoist, where social mobility was not allowed, where casteism, where varnashram dharma, were able to establish themselves as very strict orders of administration.